สวัสดีครับผมชื่อ John กับ IFC พูดภาษาไทยได้นิดหน่อย so I'll switch to English now but anyways, it's a good segue because a gentleman from Yokohama was just talking about PPP and there was a question. So I've been asked to talk specifically about PPPs for rail urban transport, LRTs, MRTs, monorail, all of those could be considered light rail. Okay. So that one changed, but this one didn't change. Okay. So just a few things to cover. First, IFC, I think we already had a speaker, my colleague, on the cable cars. You already know what IFC is, so I'll skip through that. And we'll talk about what makes PPPs useful for this type of light rail projects. And then what are some models that are typically used to implement the light rail PPPs in urban context. So we'll go ahead on these couple of slides. Why don't you just control easier? So IFC is part of the World Bank Group. You can skip to the next one. We provide investment. We help develop projects, advice to governments and private sector clients on best practices, on PPP advisory, which is the team I work for. And then we also have some asset management that we cover under mobilization. Go ahead. So what are some of the key considerations when looking at a PPP as a tool for urban light rail? This is probably not an unfamiliar slide or graph to most people, but just I think it's quite important in the context of these projects because the amounts of investment required are generally many times more than many other types of projects that cities would look to implement. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in some cases. So it's very often the case that a government or a city, local government or a city will not have that kind of money available in their budget to implement a project of that scale. So what is, go back. So what PPP allows is that in the instance of just public financing, you have to put all those funds up front. You have to have the budget available to hire the contractors to do the design, to do the construction, to commission the system. So that's a huge outlay that many cities and local governments, even national governments, often don't have available at one time. So what PPP allows you to do is to not have to pay anything while the system is being designed and constructed and commissioned. And then the payments would only start afterwards. And those would be known during when you sign the contract with the private sector. So that programming of those budgetary amounts could be done. You have several years lead time to prepare for that. So it's spreading out those capital costs over perhaps decades, 20, 30 years for a project like this. And we have to remember that we move from procuring an asset, which is the public procurement model, to procuring a service. So I want a transport system that moves this many thousands of people per day, and that's what I'm buying. I'm not buying a metro system per se. Next, please. So the decision process around PPP for urban transport, or really any major urban infrastructure, could look at four things. So you have to look at the need and viability of the project. Is it a useful project? It's not going to be sitting idle, what we call white elephant, Changsi cow. But what's also, you have to think about what's in it for private sector. What would make this something they would want to be involved with? It's one thing to have an idea and a need, but if you can't find anyone to come and be your partner, then that's going to be a constraint to doing it as a PPP. That will come from having a good or optimal allocation of risks. So looking at what all the different aspects of the project are and who delivers what, who's best suited to handle each of those. And very important for government and for constituents is, will it deliver value for money? Are the resources that you're going to be paying the private sector through availability payment or some other form of compensation for them delivering the project, is this delivering value for money? Is it a good use of public funds and resources? Can it be defended? Next. So again, what we're talking about is a tool, and the reason why PPP is so so useful for a project like these is that there's very complicated projects. There's a lot of moving parts, a lot of aspects. And what a PPP allows is for you to allocate these different responsibilities to different entities, or an single entity that will then handle all the interfaces that are required. So I like this quote. I think it's from a law firm. Can't remember the name, but they say, for LRT and metro projects, PPPs can be an effective way of transferring the substantial challenge of integrating civil works, engineering and equipment and systems, rolling stock and O&M, and preventive and life cycle maintenance for the project, and aligning these matters towards a singular goal of achieving a reliable and punctual service for an efficient price. So I think if your project can be designed to achieve all of this, then you succeeded. And there are examples of this, so it's not a miracle if this happens. It just requires good preparation and some hard work and a bit of time spent, but this can be achieved. Next. So let's look at a couple of examples of how you could do PPPs for urban light rail projects. Thanks. But first, let's talk about the main components, because I think that'll drive some of the next slides, how we divvy up who's responsible for which part. So a very typical metro system or light rail system has the rolling stock, which are the trains, of course. That's the part people interface with. You have the civil works, which is, in this case, an elevated guideway, be the stations, egress and, to the stations, getting out of the stations, and the depot where you store the trains. Among other things. In Bangkok, we have all those great connective walkways, so that would be also part of the civil works. And then you have the electromechanical, which is the signaling system, the electro system, all the things that make the trains be able to run safely. And then, of course, you have the operations and maintenance of these trains to keep the system up and running so that every 5 minutes or 3 minutes during rush hour or 2 minutes, depending on the agreed headway that our trains are coming, and people can go there and rely on this as a form of transport to get them here. Next stop. So generally we find that there are 4 main approaches. So it can range from having the private sector do everything to having them just do only one specific aspect. And there's no right or wrong. It just depends on the situation, on the factors of the specifics of the project. But the 4 main approaches, and there could be hybrids, but one is that you have the private sector responsible for all aspects of the project. They build the elevated guideway, they build all the stations, the depot, all the civil works, they put all the electromechanical aspects in, they purchase the rolling stock, and they do the O&M. So it's a turnkey, basically. You have contracted with them to deliver an entire project within an agreed time frame. So within 5 years, a metro system is running in your city as a PPP. Second is that you start to carve out what private sector does and what government can do or wants to do. And often this will be driven by some funding aspects or potentially some development assistance from a partner like another country or other donor. In this case, you have private sector responsible for everything except civil works. And I think this model has been used in Thailand, particularly for the underground, because underground has very high risks in terms of the geotechnical and very hard to predict in terms of how much it's going to cost, because you don't really know what you're going to find when you start tunneling. So I believe the MRT has been done under a model similar to this, where government's done the civil works, but the private sector is responsible for all their aspects. And then as we move down, we kind of move away from private sector. Their role is getting smaller and smaller. So the number 3 is responsible for only O&M and rolling stock, and government provides all the hardware and the civil works. And then finally, number 4 is the government does everything except for the O&M. So the government turns over a system and then asks private sector just to operate and maintain it. So these are the 4 different models. Of course, you could have variations, but generally this is what we see. Next, please. So there are pros and cons to each, and hybrids, as I said, and some factors like the delivery capacity, risk appetite, like I mentioned about the tunneling and underground, that might be too much of a risk. for private sector to take if there aren't any other underground projects in the city. So that might have to be a risk government bears for the project to work, would be an example. As also of market appetite in terms of what the private sector will want to do. So that will help guide you when you start putting these projects together and seeing who can do what. But there are some, I think, I wouldn't say non-negotiable, but almost non-negotiable aspects that government is usually responsible for providing the right of way. Under approach one, where you get the private sector to do everything, they still will not generally be responsible for purchasing land because, or getting the easements to build the system in the middle of the road in the case of SkyTrain. That all has to be granted by government, and generally government responsible for purchasing land and in some cases managing the relocation of buildings and people that are located on that land. Also, government will be responsible for what we call MAGA, or any material adverse government actions that disrupt the functioning of the project. Examples could be some change in law by government that's discriminatory to the project, or other aspect that affects the balance that was struck when the agreement was signed. And then you have this PPP agreement, or concession agreement is normally what guides these projects, and it would set out all these factors and the agreed risk allocation. Next, please. So just to show you an example of how this was done, this is a real project that we worked on in the Philippines about 10 years ago, where they were looking at getting the operation and maintenance of an existing system that needed some heavy rehabilitation because it had been running for a number of decades, and then also doing expansion of that system, quite significant expansion. So we had 4 options that were considered by our client, the Department of Transportation in the Philippines. So option 1 was what we call VGF model, where private sector did everything and government just provided the gap to make the project viable. So we say private sector, you take the fare box of the existing system, which is fairly significant, and you rehabilitate it, run it, and you build this extension, and we will just tell us how much you need upfront to make it work, and then it's all your responsibility. Option 2, they had also gotten some interest in the project from what we call ODA, or Official Development Assistance. In this case was the government of Japan. So they had offered a loan, very attractive loan, to the government of the Philippines to do this. So there were options then, what we call ODA. So option 2 was just civil works ODA. So the funding from Japan would cover the civil works needed for the new extension, and also the depot that was needed for that extension. But private sector would do the E&M, trains, and O&M. The option 3 was ODA just for the trains, because there were certain manufacturers in Japan that could provide the trains or were interested in providing them, and that would comply with the terms of the loan that was being offered. And then private sector would do everything else. And then finally, full ODA for the civil works, E&M, and trains. But in all cases, private sector needs to run it because ODA can't. And the government had decided that they were not going to be in the business of running this system anymore, because it had come to the point where they were not being able to do it well because of procurement issues and other things. So where we ended up was option 3 on this one. Okay, next slide. So a couple of last things before I open up for questions. There's a couple other points that depend on the type of project you're going to do. Is how long is the project? When we talk about approach 1, where private sector is doing everything, the turnkey solution, those generally are long-term agreements, 30+ years, because there needs to be a lot of time for them to recover the investment and pay off the loans that they are going to secure, and their return on equity, and in terms of life cycle costing. So we see 30+ years for those. Approaches 1. Even for approach 2, where they're only responsible for providing, say, rolling stock and E&M, are fairly long-term, probably tied to the life of the rolling stock, something in the range of 15 to 20 years. Also because that's a fairly significant investment. These trains are they're quite expensive, so it will take time to repay the loans for that. For O&M only, then you can get into quite shorter arrangements. So in cases where we've seen governments build the system but then get private sector to run it, they generally like to re-tender those. In case of in Spain and Portugal, I visited, and we had discussions with metro systems there that every 5 to 7 years they are rebidding the O&M to try to get better bids and to include things in the agreement that need to be done that are more relevant at the time, so that frequent rebidding allows you to be more dynamic and have an agreement that's more tailored to the situation at the time versus a 30-year where you're kind of locked in for a longer period, obviously. Next. So farebox. This is more about pretty much on the government side generally. So usually these systems, the amount that you decide to charge the customers is a political/economic decision. If you charge the fare box that's needed to recover all the investment and a return on investment, the fares would be probably too high for people to use the system, and you wouldn't get the benefits. So it's very important for the planners of a mass transit system, light rail system, to spend time to understand what the willingness to pay is, to get stakeholder consultations, to really have buy-in from the public of what would be an affordable, but not so cheap that it's undervalued and not used properly, but affordable and encourages the right amount of use. You don't want it to be so crowded that nobody really gets much out of it because they're stuffed in there all the time. So you have to have a ranking of where this fits in the transportation ecosystem in terms of costs. So one aim would be for a fare box that could cover O&M and some, maintenance, significant maintenance or renewals of the system over time. And then generally, these are done under what we call availability payment model, where the government, if it's a PPP, has an agreed amount that they pay the private sector on regular intervals, either yearly or twice a year or quarterly. And the fare box is collected by the government, and they can then control the political aspects of that. We've seen some problems where that's with private sector, and the agreement says that the fare should be increased every 2 years or 3 years, and then when that time comes to increase the fare, the government says, no, you can't. Election's coming, or people will complain, so we don't do that, and then it puts pressure on the projects, and it creates a contingent liability for government. So we're seeing more and more that availability payment model is the way to go. And Thailand they have the gross cost, net cost. I think it's the net cost one is the availability. One of them is availability payment, and they use it quite successfully here in Bangkok. Last slide. Sorry, 2 more. This one, commercial revenues. I think this was tied into a discussion the gentleman from Yokohama also had about land value capture. There's a good example with the SkyTrain here of how all the shopping malls that have come up. We see this in Hong Kong, that quite significant amount of the revenues or the value that's generated from these systems can be through this transit-oriented development, or TOD. And that should be factored into this whole economic and financial model of the project. I think that's Metro Manila too, by the way, picture over there. Next slide. And then the government support to ensure project viability, I think, is critical. Because these are, and generally a new system, it's hard to predict if people are going to use it and how often and how frequently, that your projections are often going to be off. So you are not going to know how much fare box is going to generate. There's a lot of risks, a lot of capital investment that's needed. So generally, they're implemented with a high degree of government funding. In the case of availability payment, it's all government funded in terms of the payback is they know what they're getting, and then the amount of ridership is a variable, and that the government collects the fares that the users pay. But this doesn't mean that private sector financing cannot be utilized. As we saw on that graph at the beginning of the presentation, that you can, even if you're paying them just an availability payment, you don't have to finance the implementation of this project. You can let them borrow the money for it, let them put the equity in, and you just have to commit to those regular payments as per the contract. So private sector financing can be leveraged to allow government to have a project that's very expensive and pay it back over 30 years potentially. So it's important, though, that availability payment is backed up and is creditworthy, particularly at the city and municipal level. The investors will want to see that, do you have the regular budgeting mechanism? Is there a steady stream of funds that are coming to the city that can service this payment that's obligation in the contract? Next. So I think that with that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions, and I'm open my cup.